Imagine waking up next to a man who, in the beginning, seemed like the perfect husband. Calm, devoted, and driven by a clear purpose. He radiated respect and discipline, but over time that man would transform into one of the most feared and hated figures on the planet. This is my story, the story of how I, Najwa bin Laden, was forced to live in the shadow of a man who, through his silence and his presence, changed the course of modern terrorism. In the early years of our marriage, Osama was more than just a husband. He was a man of unshakable faith, with a clear vision of the world. But as time went by, I started to notice something subtle shifting inside him. The man I love and respected began to lose himself in his own ideologies. He distanced himself from the family, from the simple joys of life, and surrendered to a radical fervor. That's when I began to ask myself, what happened to the man I married? When did he become unrecognizable? Osama's change didn't happen overnight. In the first years of our marriage, he seemed like a simple man, disciplined and deeply committed to his faith. His rejection of luxury and the materialism of his family didn't seem alarming at first. He preferred a modest life, focused on prayer, fasting, and giving to the needy. And I, with a worldview shaped by the culture and education I had received, felt proud of his devotion and discipline. To me, he was a man of unquestionable faith, someone I respected and followed, along with all children, believing we were doing the right thing. But as time passed, Osama's dedication to what he believed was a divine cause grew in ways I could no longer ignore. He began spending more time in his prayer room, his prayers becoming longer and more intense. At first, I saw this as a sign of deep faith, but soon I realized my husband's behavior was changing. The hours he spent alone reflecting on life and the world became endless. The discipline I once admired was turning into obsession. Osama started rejecting every simple pleasure life could offer. He refused the material comfort his wealthy family could easily provide, choosing instead to live in greater isolation and austerity. It was during this phase that he began studying ideologies I could never have imagined. Boxes of books started arriving, sent by secret contacts, filled with the writing of fundamentalist thinkers and jihadist leaders. Osama devoured those pages, often reading them out loud to our children, without realizing that those teachings were creating a foundation that would pull us further away from the life we once knew. Ideas of martyrdom, jihad, and hatred toward the United States, Israel, and even Arab government began to creep into his words. Soon he came to see the world as a place of corruption that could only be purified through armed struggle. By then, the man I had built a life and a family with was no longer the man I recognized. I didn't know how to react, so I tried to adapt to the new reality Osama imposed on us. I never questioned him. That would go against everything I had been taught, against the society we lived in. But my uneasiness grew as his ideology took on proportions I couldn't fully understand. Yet I knew they were dangerous. I felt like I was losing myself, living in the shadow of a man who had turned into something I feared more than I loved. When I first married Osama, I believed my role as a wife was to follow my husband with devotion, as my culture and fate demanded. I saw him as a disciplined man with a clear purpose. I rejected worldly vanity and saw a life of austerity. But as Osama plunged deeper into his religious ideology, my submission became more and more demanding. What began as a respect for his faith and dedication to his cause slowly turned into obligation that I felt like a prison. I was raised to obey without question, so I could never have imagined the extent of the control Osama wanted to have over my life. Although he was never physically violent, Osama exercised absolute psychological and emotional dominance over me. He believed that as his wife I should follow his orders without hesitation, and he enforced this belief rigidly, especially as he drifted further away from the family life and deeper into his radical calling. Osama, with his authoritarian silence, never needed to raise his voice to control the environment around him. His very presence made everyone bend to his will, including me. He didn't see me as an equal partner, but as someone who existed primarily to obey. This was evident in the smallest details of daily life. The way he controlled the children's behavior, the strict routines in the house. Rules were imposed with no room for discussion or dissent. At first, living in obedience felt natural to me because that was how I had been raised. I believed that a good husband was one who led his family without challenge. That was the foundation of my understanding. But as Osama became more devoted to his extremist ideas and his ideology grew more radical, I began to realize that I was trapped into a life without a voice. My existence revolved around fulfilling his expectations. But the cost of that submission was becoming painfully clear. The man I had married had turned into a stranger, someone I could no longer trust or confide in. His silence became heavier than any scream. He didn't need harsh words to control me. His presence alone was enough to create an atmosphere of fear and obedience. Although Osama was never physically violent, his presence was powerful enough to dominate our home in a way that felt silent yet deeply oppressive. His form of violence wasn't expressed through shouting or aggression, but through an invisible tension, a constant sense that any act of resistance, any question would be unacceptable. Simply existing in that environment and not following his rules felt like rebellion. Osama never had to raise his voice because his authority was absolute and unspoken. Over time, I began to notice that what once seemed like religious discipline was turning into something darker. Osama grew more distant and obsessed with his cause, and the pressure on our family intensified. There was no longer room for lightness or simple happiness. The children's laughter was silenced, and any sign of fun or relaxation was considered a moral failure. I lived in a state of constant vigilance, always alert for the slightest signs of Osama's disapproval. Consumed by his ideological obsession, Osama began imposing stricter rules on our children. They were pressured to live by the principles of Jihad. He believed they should grow up strong, without the right to question or express emotions normal for their age. I felt more and more powerless, unable to ease the burden on them, or even share my own anguish. The greatest violence I suffered was not physical pain but emotional isolation. Osama withdrew further and further, as his obsession with ideology mattered more than any family bond. I tried to reach him, bringing him food, attempting to speak with him, but he ignored me, immersed in his notes and radical studies. When I expressed my worries or sadness, he brushed me aside, as if my voice didn't matter in the world he was creating. That emotional violence, invisible to anyone outside those walls, slowly consumed me. I felt my identity fading, my voice silenced, my will weakening. I was drowning in a sea of rules and expectations, no longer sure who I was beyond a submissive wife and an obedient mother. As Osama sank deeper into his radical beliefs, he began introducing our children, even the youngest ones, to the idea of jihad, a sacred struggle that, to him, was the only legitimate way to live. What had started as concern for faith and religious practice evolved into something far more dangerous, far more extreme. Osama didn't just reject the Western world as its temptations. He taught our children that by following his path they would fulfill a divine purpose. From that moment on, our home would no longer be just a family dwelling. It became a training ground, a place of preparation for an endless war. I watched helplessly as my husband imposed increasingly rigid rules on our children's behavior. Each day, the boys were pulled further away from the normal lives children should have. No games, no friends, no moments of carefree joy. Their true education wasn't about understanding the world. It was about living for jihad, about preparing for the fight against those Osama saw as enemies of God. They weren't allowed to play like normal children, couldn't laugh out loud, and even visits to relatives were forbidden because Osama believed such simple human interaction would corrupt them. Osama spoke about jihad with such passion that even I found myself being consumed by the idea that fighting was the only answer to what he believed was a corrupted world. I began to realize, painfully, that my role in the family was more than being a submissive wife. I was also expected to be a guardian of his ideology. But my anguish grew with every passing day. When I saw my children so devoted to this idea, when I watched them transform from innocent children into young boys who were beginning to believe that war was a virtue, I didn't know how to react. I feared for the future, yet I felt that questioning Osama or trying to change anything would mean defying his authority and, ultimately, my own place in that system. In my moments of solitude, when Osama was away traveling or meeting with his followers, I tried to shield my children from the ideology being forced upon them. But deep down, I knew I was losing the battle. What could I offer them? A normal childhood? I kept asking myself how I could give my children back their humanity when everything around them thought that martyrdom was the highest honor. The introduction of Jihad into our lives didn't only change my children, it shattered my own peace of mind, forcing me to confront a reality where obedience and acceptance were the only ways to survive, both inside my home and in the world we lived in. The move to Sudan left me feeling disoriented and isolated. While Osama saw this relocation as an opportunity to advance his mission, I felt as though I was being pushed further away from everything I knew, into a place without roots, where my identity and safety were constantly at risk. For me, Sudan wasn't a fresh start. It was forced exile, where the promises of a peaceful, secure life felt distant and unreachable. The surroundings were barren and lifeless compared to the comfort of Saudi Arabia, and the house of Osama found for us was far from a home. It was simple, stripped of all the comforts I had once known, but to Osama, the simplicity was a reflection of his purified ideology. He found peace in it. For me, every day in Sudan felt like an emotional struggle for survival. I felt myself slipping away more and more each day. The emotional distance between Osama and me grew unbearable, and the fear of questioning him or asking for something different became overwhelming. The woman who once had been his partner was disappearing, replaced by a submissive figure with no room for doubts or feelings of her own. I tried to focus on the children, but the world Osama created offered them no joy, no freedom. The silence inside our home was suffocating. There were no more laughs, no more casual family conversations. Everything revolved around Osama's cause and the rigid discipline he enforced. On top of the emotional isolation, the outside reality grew harsher. Sudan, with his political and religious instability, was nothing like the safe haven Osama believed it would be. The pressure of living in a place where my husband and children were constantly watched, where identity and loyalty were always under scrutiny, made me feel not only physically exiled but also spiritually and mentally imprisoned. I knew I was being consumed by a life I had never chosen. But once again, I had no choice but to follow. The loneliness grew deeper, and the feeling of being in a prison without walls became more and more unbearable. For me, Sudan was a place of isolation, both physical and emotional, where any hope of escaping my reality faded as Osama's influence over our children and over my life intensified. I began to understand that maybe my life would never return to what it once was. That this was a new phase where obedience to my husband was the only way to survive. Though, in truth, it was a survival without a soul. Over time, Osama's transformation became undeniable and relentless. The calm, disciplined man who once rejected luxury for a simple life had vanished, replaced by someone who no longer saw any limits. His obsession with jihad and building a network of militants consumed every aspect of his existence. Osama was no longer just a husband or a father. He had become a radical leader with a clear mission. Arms struggle against what he saw as the corruptions of the Western world and the impure Muslim leadership. He believed that the only path to purification was through war, martyrdom, and sacrifice. I began to realize just how deep this transformation went. Osama distanced himself more and more from his family, devoting almost all his time to shaping his ideology and recruiting followers. Our home, once filled with children and moments of family life, turned into a planning hub for his radical cause. He welcomed men who shared his beliefs, men ready to fight against what they considered oppression. These meetings were quiet but intense, filled with conversation about jihad, purification, and resistance. For me, they were stark reminders that my life was no longer mine. I was merely a spectator to my husband's revolution. The impact of this radicalization on our children was devastating. Osama no longer cared about their childhood or their right to be children. Instead, he was training them to become soldiers in what he believed was a divine mission. The rules tightened even more. The boys were taught to rise early for prayer, to show no weakness, to suppress emotions like sadness or fear. Osama wasn't just raising warriors, he was creating what he believed to be the only true future for them. As Osama grew into a more imposing, radical figure, I felt increasingly powerless. I had started my journey as a devoted wife. But now, faced with my husband's radicalization, I realized I had no control over anything anymore. My identity, once tied to being a wife and a mother, was dissolving, swallowed by Osama's vision. More than ever, I felt trapped, emotionally isolated. I watched, helpless, as this change overtook my family. And the worst part, I knew I couldn't escape this reality without paying an unimaginable price. Osama had become impenetrable, a man living in a separate world, detached from his wife, his children, and even from the humanity he once knew. Back then, I understood that the only thing left for me was to survive his radical transformation. And even as I lived in constant silence, the pain and emptiness inside me grew deeper with every passing day. As Osama's radicalization solidified, He didn't just drift away from his family, he began to be recognized as a leader by others. The man who once confined himself to silent criticism and intense prayers was now at the center of an expanding network of militants and followers. For me, the meetings in our home, once rare and almost family like, became frequent and secretive, filled with men who shared Osama's radical vision, spoke of tragedies, missions, and increasingly the comeback that seemed inevitable. Home, once a place of family life, became a spiritual and ideological training ground. My children, the same one who once played with toys and laughed freely, were now being taught to see the world through an entirely different lens. Their education no longer focused on learning or ordinary life experience. It was rooted in blind obedience, devotion to the cause, and preparation for joy ahead. Violence was no longer a distant possibility. It was a reality Osama was actively preparing them for, whether through force or through death. I tried to stay close to my children, to talk to them during rare quiet moments, but Osama's growing presence and that of his followers in our home made it harder every day. My world was shrinking. I could no longer see a way out. Meanwhile, Osama was becoming a charismatic leader, capable of influencing and attracting men from all over the world. His word was treated as unquestionable truth, and his followers saw him as a guide to a new era, an era of struggle, purification, and ultimately domination. This rise to leadership wasn't just a shift on ideology, it was an assertion of power. He no longer saw himself as just a husband or a father. He was now the leader of a revolution that was slowly consuming everything in its path. For me, this change meant that Osama no longer belonged to me or to our family. He belonged to a greater world, a world at war. The family which had once been his priority was now abandoned. In those moments, I felt as though I was living beside a man who, although the father of my children, no longer recognized me as his partner. Osama had become almost untouchable, impenetrable, and all I could do was watch, and he drifted further and further away from everything I believed could still hold us together. After the move to Sudan, Osama began to see the country as a place where his radical vision could still take root. But international pressure and actions by the Sudanese government forced yet another relocation. The exile continued, this time to Afghanistan, where Osama believed he could finally build his sacred refuge, a place far from the eyes of the Western world, where he could explain his network of militants and prepare his force for what he saw as a global war against the infidels. For me, the move to Afghanistan was another crushing blow. Sudan had been hard enough, but Afghanistan was an entirely different world, harsher, more desolate. The landscape was barren, war lingered constantly on the horizon, and living conditions were extremely harsh. The house we lived in, compared to what we had in Saudi Arabia, was not a home, but a shelter for survival. Thin walls, no comforts, limited food, and constant tension created a grim reality in which I felt myself slipping further away, not just from my former life, but from who I was. Osama, now with more followers and more fanatical than ever, threw himself completely into his projection of building a radical empire. His idea of purification through suffering now extended to our home. Instead of an united family, there was only rigid discipline imposed on our children and on everything and everyone under his command. I was no longer the wife who cared for her home and children with affection. I had become a mere administration of a militarized life, a life dictated entirely by Osama's unyielding rules. Our sons, especially the older ones, were slowly transformed into soldiers. There were no longer any room for childhood, play, or innocence. Everything revolved around preparation for Jihad. When Osama spoke about martyrdom, our children listened with reverence, as if it were the only truth that mattered. The harsh living conditions in Afghans were seen by Osama as a test, a way of purifying his family. For me, it was the loss of everything I had ever known and loved. The man I had married, the one who once shared with me simple dreams and a life of prayer, now seemed completely consumed by the cause. In that relentless, merciless environment, I experienced the silence of my own existence. There was no room to question, no way to change anything. My life was entirely defined by Osama's will, and once again, I find myself without choices. Afghanistan wasn't just a geographical exile. It was an emotional, spiritual, and physical exile. It was a place where humanity itself seemed to have been abandoned in the name of an ideology that spared no one, not even those who closest to him. As Osama continued his obsessive quest to build an empire of militants and followers, something unexpected began to happen inside our home. Omar, our eldest son, who until then had been submissive and obedient, started questioning his father's teachings. The radicalized environment Osama had created around our family seemed natural to many of the children, but not to Omar. He was becoming increasingly unsettled by the life his father was trying to impose. And in his moments of introspection, his rebellion surfaced in subtle but dangerous ways. Omar, with his intelligence and sensitivity, began to see the harshness of life under Osama's control. He didn't want to blindly follow the path of martyrdom that his father praised as the greatest honor of a man could achieve. For Osama, jihad was the only legitimate purpose of life, and any resistance to that was seen as weakness or betrayal. When Osama noticed signs of resistance in his sons, like Omar's curiosity about the life beyond those walls of radicalism, he reacted with coldness and disapproval. When I saw the growing distance between father and son, I tried everything I could to ease the tension inside our home. I tried to give Omar moments of peace, of rest, but those attempts to bring even a trace of humanity into my children's lives were constantly suffocated by Osama's rigidity. I knew my voice had lost its power in that house, and that any effort to protect my son could only be seen as an act of betrayal. Still, I couldn't ignore Omar's suffering, the way he was changing from a curious boy into a young man crushed under the weight of an ideology he'd never asked for. The tension between father and son reached a breaking point when Omar openly expressed his desire to live a different life. He questioned the lack of joy, the absence of freedom, and even Osama's ideals about jihad. To Osama, this was a clear sign of weakness. He called Omar an infidel for daring to disrespect what he considered sacred teachings. His words, always spoken with unshakable authority, now sounded more threatening to Omar than ever. I knew the situation was becoming unbearable. The conflict between the two most important men in my life was not just about ideology, it was the inevitable consequences of an emotional fracture. It broke my heart to see my son, the gentle boy who once dreamed freely, being forced into a mold he didn't want to fit. For me, Omar's rebellion wasn't just resistance, it was a silent cry for freedom, for a life without the chains of his father's ideology. After years of silence and emotional suffering, I finally reached a breaking point. I knew that to ensure my children's survival and reclaim my life, I had to escape the prison Osama had built around us. Our home, once a sanctuary, had become a place of desolation, where oppression replaced any trace of joy. Osama's radicalization had destroyed our family, and no matter how much I tried to remain faithful to my upbringing and my role as a wife, I knew the time to act had come. The decision to flee was not easy. For one raised to obey without question, to find my husband's authority was more than rebellion. It was the shattering of an identity. The growing tension, especially with Omar's defiance and the fear of escalating violence, forced me to act. I knew the life Osama envisioned for his children offered no freedom, only suffering and war. I planned my escape with the utmost caution. One mistake could mean death for me and my children. Without showing any sign of suspicion, I moved in absolute silence, making sure Osama would not know. With the children trapped in their father's rigid discipline, the escape demanded courage, but also a strength I never knew I possessed. One night, while Osama was away, I gathered my children and prepared them. I packed our bags, hid documents, and, with a quiet resolve, left behind the life I once knew. The escape was simple, without tearful goodbyes, but it was decisive. We crossed borders in search of an uncertain future, but one free from the ideology and control that had chained us for so long. The escape was more than a bid for physical freedom. It was a reclaiming of my voice, my choice. I knew the road ahead would be hard, but there was no turning back. The pain of what I left behind will never leave me, but the freedom at last was mine. My story is one of resistance, courage, and the fight for freedom. Do you believe it's possible to break free from a cycle of violence and control like mine? Share your thoughts below. And if my story touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. Subscribe for more stories of strength and survival.